On August 19, 1966, Air Force One touched down at the Greater Buffalo International Airport at 1:20 p.m. Emerging from the Boeing jet, President Lyndon Johnson was accompanied by his wife, Lady Bird, and greeted by numerous dignitaries, including Buffalo Mayor Frank Sedita and New York State Governor Nelson Rockefeller. This visit to Buffalo was the first stop of a 3-day speaking tour through 5 states, focusing on water pollution. During his visit, President Johnson famously stated that Lake Erie must be saved, and Governor Rockefeller proclaimed that the heavily polluted Buffalo River would be restored by 1970. But it was the voice and actions of one citizen that day that resonated the loudest and was the catalyst to early environmental restoration in Buffalo and the Great Lakes. A local businessman and self-taught conservationist named Stanley Spisiak was the star of the show. He was a self-described environmentalist as far back as the 1930s. Stan spent decades fighting for local waters, enduring threats to his life, physical violence, and public ridicule. Earlier that year, Stan had been in Washington, D.C. to receive a National Conservation Award for his decades of advocacy. Seated next to Lady Bird Johnson, he described the horrific conditions of the Buffalo River and the dumping of pollution into Lake Erie. He invited the First Lady to come to Buffalo to see the mess for herself, and she was welcome to bring her husband with her. Upon arrival to Buffalo that August day, the president and his entourage boarded a Coast Guard vessel and toured the Inner Harbor. According to a 1974 Sports Illustrated interview with Stan, this is what happened next. Never one to be subtle, Stan had pulled up a bucket of industrial sludge from the bottom of the Buffalo River, shoved it under the president's nose, and gave him a large spoon to stir it with. Can you imagine doing that in this day and age? Stan stated, "Mr. President, this is what your Army Corps of Engineers is dumping in Lake Erie." And the president's reply, "Those bastards. Don't worry, I'll take care of it." A few weeks later, the president did take care of it. He signed an executive order prohibiting the practice, and that's an order that still exists to this day. The words and actions of Stanley Spisiak demonstrate how impactful an individual citizen can become. I share this story not only as a way to help describe the environmental conditions of the mid-20th century, but to talk about the ways and strategies that citizens can use and do to affect change. Rust Belt cities and their industrial economies were built along the shores of the largest freshwater system in the world. In the Western New York region, our Great Lakes geography, combined with cheap hydropower, railroads, and canal infrastructure, all contributed to making the city of Buffalo having the 9th largest economy in the world in the early 1900s. Because of these assets, chemical production and manufacturing took hold along our region's waterfront. Great Lakes communities like Western New York manufactured the steel, the chemicals, and the petroleum products that helped win 2 world wars and grow the nation's economy. But with the economic transition away from manufacturing, our home was left with abandoned waterfront industrial sites like Bethlehem Steel, and we became a dumping ground for hazardous waste at places like Love Canal. By the 1960s, nearly 60% of the Niagara River's wetlands were lost. The Buffalo River caught fire 4 times, the largest being in 1968 due to a workman's torch that sparked the oils and greases on its surface. By 1969, the Federal Water Pollution Control Agency deemed the Buffalo River biologically dead. And in 1970, the state of Ohio Department of Health declared Lake Erie dead. Things were so bad here that a national stigma of pollution was attached to our community. It was even expressed in the 1971 children's book, The Lorax, with the line that lamented the loss of the hummingfish who no longer hummed because their gills were all gummed. And I quote Dr. Seuss here, "They'll walk on their fins and get woefully weary in search of some water that isn't so smeary. I hear things are just as bad up in Lake Erie." When things become a crisis, then laws and action usually follow. In response to the degraded environmental conditions in the United States, on April 22, 1970, the first Earth Day was held. This was pushed forth by the reawakening and activism of American citizens like Stanley Spisiak. 20 million people took to the streets that day. By the early 1970s, some progress was being made with the passage of landmark environmental legislation, including the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. The Environmental Protection Agency was established, and in 1972, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement was signed between the US and Canada. Even with this new environmental movement, many communities were still left behind, including our home here in Western New York. How do communities emerge from over 100 years of a Rust Belt legacy? How do communities restore their waterfronts after decades of pollution and abuse? As we have learned in Buffalo, one strategy lies within the collective power of the community itself, driven by the passion and commitment of the people who call these places home. Sometimes individuals will band together into a formal organization, such as my own. Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper is a nonprofit organization founded 30 years ago by a handful of concerned citizens who voluntarily organized in order to raise awareness in the community in order to protect and restore the Buffalo River. Over time, our mission and impact grew. Individual action was magnified by the thousands. Scientific knowledge increased about our local waterways. And we even spearheaded many of the partnerships and actions needed to restore the Buffalo River and other local waterways. 15 years ago, the Buffalo River was still a struggling, degraded river system. But after 10 years and nearly $100 million in collaborative efforts, the restoration is nearing completion and is now considered one of the nation's largest waterway cleanups. Today, the river's on the mend, a hotbed of economic activity estimated to be close to $400 million and growing. It supports waterfront recreation, mixed-use development, and a thriving ecotourism industry. Our region is transforming its waterfront by growing our own version of a blue economy, one that prioritizes clean, healthy, accessible waterways for everyone that results in improved quality of life and economic well-being. Several recent studies demonstrate a 4-to-1 economic return on waterway restoration and investment. And Western New York's emerging blue economy demonstrates that clean water can be an engine for economic recovery, that the restoration and cleanup operations are directly and indirectly creating jobs, and when the ecology of the waterways and shorelines come back to life, the communities and economies around them will come back to life too. As our own organization grew and evolved, we identified 4 key strategies in which to guide citizen action for the greatest impact. First, carry a bold vision. Second, consistent communication and messaging. Third, educate and engage the entire community. And finally, don't be afraid to advocate. Buffalo, New York is a mid-sized Great Lakes city sharing an international border with Canada along Lake Erie and the Niagara River. But for generations, our community avoided its own waterfront due to polluted water, polluted lands, and physical barriers like industrial sites and highways. The only way we could access our Great Lakes was to literally travel to another country, where we would spend summers at inspiring-sounding locations like Crystal Beach, Shirkston Shores, and Thunder Bay. How does a community lacking a water identity or even physical connections to the water establish that bold vision for waterfront revitalization? It starts with this basic principle. We need water to survive every day. For Western New York residents, our bodies are 75% Great Lakes water. Polluting the water means polluting ourselves, our children, our friends and neighbors. Carrying the bold rust to blue vision helped change the conversation. Things didn't always have to be the way they've always been on our waterfront. This consistent message eventually influenced cultural attitudes and behaviors towards water. It even drove media narratives and headlines about water restoration and growing a blue economy as part of our regional economic development strategy. It's not only about where you want to go, but but it's the process in which you get there that sometimes can have the most meaning and impact. Through our efforts to restore the Buffalo River, over the decades, we held hundreds of meetings with elected officials, agency heads, business and civic leaders, community groups, and individual residents to talk about creating a shared vision for the Buffalo waterfront. Early on, we were met with a little cynicism that the problems were too big, too complicated, too expensive. The general feedback we received was dismissive, sort of like, yeah, right, good luck with that one. Personally, I've been called everything from a Pollyanna to a tree hugger, and from a project killer to a fish lover, which is my favorite. But that process was critical to identify the vision and the actions that our community eventually put into motion together. Over time and through trial and error, we learned how to communicate a bold vision to many different audiences. One of the best pieces of advice I had ever received from a former board member was to learn how to speak human about our environmental challenges. Don't talk about chronic toxicity levels of contaminants and macroinvertebrates that bioaccumulate in the food chain. We want to be able to eat the fish and swim in our local waters without getting sick. And don't talk about what best management practices are used to reduce E. coli and effluent from combined sewer overflows. What we're really saying, there's shit in the river when it rains, and we need to fix it. Where words are important, it is often the actions that make the bold vision become a reality. Who will work to protect something they don't have access to, or they don't understand, or they can't experience for themselves in some way? We address these barriers through a wide range of activities, including citizen science, volunteerism, and other activities. I think back to some of my own memories of playing in local creeks as a child. I used to go down to the playground and collect tadpoles and toads, and much to the dismay of my parents, I would bring them home and make little houses and swimming pools for them. It wasn't the most stunning waterfront environment, but it was my neighborhood, and the only regular exposure that I would ever have to nature. Playing in that crick, as Western New Yorkers like to say, was a defining memory of my childhood. It wasn't until later in my professional life that I learned that that funky smell that was always present was actually a sanitary sewer overflow. And the water I played in often was mixed with human sewage. Yeah, I played in poop water as a kid. And I'm sure it may come as a shock to many of you who grew up in Western New York that you probably did as well. You can't unthink that now, can you? Good. Informed leaders with a sense of empathy make better decisions for our community. The biggest challenge to guiding citizen action is focusing that energy and sustaining it for the long term. We have learned that you not only have to show up, but speak up frequently. Not always necessarily to fight against something, but to come to the table with possible solutions. I'll let you in on a little secret. Advocacy is not a bad word. Advocates raise awareness of an issue and oftentimes build the case for funding or action. Fish don't vote, and our waterways don't have a Lorax. That is why public speaking and public testimony and advocacy can be one of the most impactful things that an individual citizen or concerned group can do. I know from personal experience that public speaking can be very intimidating. There's a stigma that environmentalists are obstructionists or we're labeled as special interests. But we have learned that you can be an advocate and a problem solver and a partner all at the same time. The story of the Buffalo River's remarkable recovery is shared around the world as evidence that this approach can work. Plain and simple, consistent advocacy led to the restoration of our dead river. You don't have to be a professional environmentalist to improve the environment. You just have to care and do something, big or small. Your personal behaviors and actions matter. Tonight, you can look on a map to see what waterways are near where you live. Tomorrow, you can begin to reduce the amount of single-use plastics you use. Next week, You can refrain from applying pesticides to your lawn. Next month, you can submit a public comment or attend a public hearing about water resource protection. Next spring, you can volunteer for a shoreline cleanup in your community. The list goes on and on. Water advocates champion our cause not simply because it is our job or somebody else has asked us to do it, but because we are driven by our own inspirations, our own stories, and our love of community. Find your inspiration. Tell your story. Make positive change in your community. That's exactly what my great uncle, Stanley Spisiak, did, and so can you.